Wow, guys. You don't have any extra one. No. You get 5. I only do 5. Only 5. Okay, I'm asking you. There's a microphone everywhere. You have a microphone. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the grand finals of BBBC 2016. Inside of the government, we have Team Toothless. 2 speakers in the team are Gabriel Charlotte and Revaldi Nathaniel. In open opposition, we have Team Black Mirror. Speakers in those teams are Albert and Kasun. Those in government, we have Unholy Alliance. Speakers in that team is Benjamin Go and Joel Law. Team Tyrian Lannister, closing opposition, we have Jan Dylan Chai and Samuel Chan. Chairing these finals will be myself, Sheikh Faisal, and from House Academy Events, Terrence Aaron from UT Mara, Deborah Mo from UMS, Zulfa Lee from UMS, and Sir Mario from UGM Indonesia. With the motion that this House prefers a world where individuals are taxed proportionately to their racial privileges, I call upon the first speaker, the Prime Minister, Gabriel Charlotte, to start the debate. Here. Some housekeeping rules. Please keep your voices down if you would like to have discussions. Please silence your phones and do not distract.
I think that the problem right now are covert advantages that certain people of a racial group gets when they are accessing jobs constitutes racial privilege, Mr. Madam Chair. Because we think racial privilege means that your particular race, and failing with other types of benefits, other types of privilege that you get out of this particular race, allows you to get promotion, allows you to get higher chance of being recruited, allows you to get the basic thing that you need in order to get those jobs in the form of education. In opening government, we're going to show you why those privileges are unfairly accumulated for years, yet it remains covert, and even if it's not remaining covert, it remains undealt with by the government. And it's time for us to break that bubble and make sure that these people acknowledge their privilege and do the measures necessary in order to reduce such privilege and distribute resources accordingly to people of the minority. We're going to do this proposal. Firstly, we think that we must assume feasibility. We must assume that we do quantify racial privilege that each individual of a particular minority group has. Secondly, we think that there will be some sort of standard tax or a certain rate of minimum tax that people can get. However, it's going to increase proportionally in accordance with such privilege that we've managed to quantify, Mr. Madam Chair. Third of all, of course, these taxes will be used, and most importantly, will be used for redistributive purposes for people of the racial minority. And lastly, in this universe, we must assume that fights for equality will still be there, that government and even grassroots movement are still going to be there in order to fight for such equality of racial, in terms of racial issues. Let's talk about contributions coming from opening government. We're going to talk to you first about how this race is exactly correlated with the disproportionate advantage that people accumulate that people get when they apply for jobs. First of all, we think that this disproportionate advantage stems from the very basic stepping stone of going to work, and that is from education, Mr. Madam Chair. Because most likely, those with racial privilege has the opportunity to access this education first and foremost, in contrast to that of the minority group. Inside the system of governance, which most likely is prevalent with a certain majority to begin with, or inside the culture of society or families who are often feeling who have certain supremacy towards their own race, most likely, ladies and gentlemen, they will only want to propel that of their own race by having, for instance, a certain educational system that favors the acceptance of a certain racial group. That is why, for instance, we see in the United States of America in the past, African Americans were used to mere slaves. Instead, educational access were only granted to those of the Caucasian descent. Because here's the thing, right? We think that this type of policy of education particularly empowers people of the majority, because those in power will want to propel the agenda of his own race to begin with, Mr. Madam Chair. Because only through education, people can be empowered to get precisely the qualities requested by the workforce to begin with. We're talking about, for instance, jobs that require high knowledge, such as being engineers or doctors and so on and so forth, and considering the limited amount of seats, for instance, of the pursuit of academic, we think that it's only going to be granted to those who exactly has the privilege to begin with, and it's further propped up by the fact that the government, for instance, comes from the majority. These, we think, are systematic advantages that even if we do concede that this systematic advantage is now being reduced by having affirmative action and whatnot, the number of people who gets limited access in regards to education is still very prevalent, and it's being dominated by those of the majority race, Mr. Manager. Most likely, for instance, the white community, who are already privileged due to generations of educated families, who, well, coming from the access of jobs that they have, will most likely the benefit will most likely go down to their children and their descent, in contrast to that of people of color, for instance. And that, first and foremost, is in regards to why education empowers the elites, the majority. But secondly, when you're talking about jobs, you're also talking about network, right? Because most likely inside this empire of companies and whatnot, it involves groups of people that are already considering the initial cycle of exclusive that I set out in my first contribution. We're also talking about people of that particular place dominating a certain company or having more share inside a certain company to manage it. However, you must also understand, right, that when you're talking about work, you're also talking about groups of people that you're acquainted with, for instance, people you often interact. Your circles are people who can give you letters of recommendations, for instance. Therefore, most likely, right, these people who own companies or enterprises will most likely favor you because you have more access, for instance, to interact with those people of the majority, Mr. Manager. Even if you cannot take that, I think that due to the quality that your race seemingly possess, the implicit mechanism that comes to play inside the minds of companies, of employers, is most likely will opt into choosing you in contrast to people of other colors. What does this contribution show? It indicates that these opportunities for people of the minorities has been taken away disproportionately because of these robust reasons as to why people of the majority is more empowered in this regard. Therefore, Mr. Manager, we must be able to make sure that these opportunities are equally distributed, and the only way to do it is by the following impacts, which I will further elucidate. Sure.
All the privilege you're talking about already is manifested in terms of income inequality. We can tax it out as well. What's wrong with that?
We don't think that income, in terms of income, there's still these things that requires a lot of practical, Mr. Manager, and here it's going to be discussed in my last form of contribution. But before proceeding as to how capital is still needed, high amount of capital is still needed, we must be able to show you the impacts of how it's going to change the behavior of people in the racial majority, right? This is going to change the behavior of people precisely inside the company, for instance, or employers, because in our scenario, their incentive structure will be changed because now their income and their livelihood is what that is at stake, Mr. Manager. And there has never been any proposal coming from government that challenges precisely this, especially considering the vast amount of resources going to be taken away from them, considering the racial privilege that they have, right? So we think that when their doors were at stake, they will be most willing to want to make sure that there is equal redistribution of resources for people of the minority to begin with. For example, you're going to see more employers who are now related to providing more recruitments for people in minority groups. You're going to see more companies, for instance, providing scholarships or providing empowerment of leader union, for instance, because those are where the helps are needed for people in the minority. Right? And second of all, we're also talking about co-workers who are going to be less discriminative when giving, for example, peer reviews, right, in terms of interacting with that of the other minority. And that, in the very best case scenario, is going to change the behavior of people if we're willing to share and make sure that other races are as equal standing with them. But lastly, in the very worst case, right, in which all of these efforts still needs to go to the hands of government. We think that government will have more revenue at least to pursue more things that equalizes all of these standing. For instance, government will have more money to make sure that more schools are open in areas of jobs, for example, in which racial minorities reside, and therefore have more capacity to make sure that education is touched by these individuals. And we do understand that these things need a lot of capital, and the only way to do it is therefore by making sure that the burden falls on the people who has been disproportionately advantaged, and therefore we should go with opening learning.
Thank you very much for the speech. Before I go for the next speaker from the European opposition, I'd like to remind the crowd to keep it down, the volume. Also reminding the speakers, if you'd like to ask the POI, please use the microphone as we give it to you. Also bring up your microphone to the podium if you want to speak. So I call upon the first speaker from the European opposition, Leader of Opposition, Albert.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the position of opening opposition is simple. We think the government and state should be colorblind when it comes to addressing problems of inequality of the birth lottery. And we have a couple of very good arguments why that should be so. Number one, we will tell you why it's principally wrong for the state to punish individuals for the failure of the state to mitigate the birth lottery and its consequences. Secondly, we'll tell you why also that this opening government is essentially institutionalizing racial differences and crystallizing the very structures that harm people that is prevalent in status quo. Thirdly, I'll tell you why taxation based on income is a good enough form of redistribution with regards to the problems of privilege. Right? Most of the material will already respond to opening government case. But let me quickly point something out, right? Notice she didn't actually answer my POI. When I asked her what kinds of privilege, this is very important for government to respond to. Specifically, what kinds of privilege are not manifested in terms of economic conditions? Because if they do, our policy solves that. And we're very happy on opening opposition to have a higher degree of taxation for individuals who make more money. right? And we think that also deals with the issue of having more income and revenue for people, right? So we think those benefits can also occur outside with a higher income tax rate for individuals who are more wealthy. But the question that Gov needs to answer is exactly what kind of privilege doesn't manifest in terms of higher income, and why then do we need to tax individuals double for this sort of privilege that they have, and why, and we need to answer that question. Right? First argumentation, right? Why is it principally wrong for the state to punish individuals, especially for the failure the state to mitigate the birth lottery? Recognize that a lot of times, within that individuals don't choose the world they're born in, don't choose the set of circumstances they're born in, right? Even if you happen to be born in a rich family, even if you happen to be born white, right? You don't choose those circumstances that are born across, right? The way states need to deal with this is to recognize that a one common denominator across all individuals with regards to addressing inequality is income inequality, because we recognize that all kinds of privilege will manifest in terms of income anyway, and we think that taxation on that will redistribute that wealth to individuals who need it the most, right? But this particular policy has a few fundamental principal harms. Number one, it's a form of discrimination on a specific group of individuals. We think it's incredibly unfair, not just because it's a discrimination, but we think more importantly, we think this is government that imposes a higher value judgment on racial disenfranchisement as opposed to other forms of disenfranchisement, right? We think we can equally argue to you that being a woman is incredibly disenfranchising in today's world. That being a disabled person is an equally disenfranchising thing in today's world. Why is this government placing an unfair value judgment on what disenfranchisement is more important across the board, right? As opposed to addressing things on a case-by-case basis when your privileges do accrue in terms of income, right? So we think what ultimately they do, they disempower individuals because they rob them of agency with regards to tying their worth to arbitrary things. They're telling you you're only worthwhile to the state because of your race, and we think that's something that's incredibly harmful. Secondly, right, we think that state is institutionalizing racial differences. Because we think this is tacit endorsement that it's okay to classify people according to their race, right? And we think that's incredibly harmful. Why? Because you transfer the broad generalizations that you have of people, you're just moving them across racial lines, right? So we think now what you're doing essentially is they're saying that you crystallize the notion that, say, for example, that black people suffer more inequalities because of things like maybe through stereotypes, the lazy, and so on and so forth, right? And then secondly, you continue to otherize people. This is particularly important, right? You continue to otherize people, especially when it comes to making an enemy out of white people, reviewing them as enemies of people who are poor. When the situation really is not just a race war, but it ultimately is down to socioeconomic problems, like about class, not about race, right? So this is incredibly harmful to otherize people. Conclusion, in the short term, right, we think you validate the negative stereotypes people already have on minorities, right, and also encourages tokenism with regards to that, right? But I think in the long term, we think you crystallize this racial structures that exist, and we think the culture of treating people differently just because of the race continue to exist on their side, because it now not only is culturally true, but also state sanctioned. So as a society, we don't think government can actually move away from treating people differently just because you're a particular race, right? So it may be good for black people in the long term, right? But we think that those kind of nasty generalizations can also affect other people when it's shifted away, right? So for example, when you otherize white people, they will then bear the brunt of cultural disenfranchisement as well, because they crystallize those structures to exist, and they can persist on the other side as well, right? Thirdly, why do we think taxation is good enough as a form of redistribution? Before that, closing.
How do you think a white American view the opportunity in life vis-a-vis the black American?
Right, so we think that their worldviews are shaped as much as their racial worldviews are shaped as well. So we think what ultimately matters is their socioeconomic status as well, because we don't think it's fair to say that a poor white man is less privileged. A poor white man is more privileged than a rich black man, right? So we think that this is represented across many lines, right? We think we don't think this exists according to racial lines, right? Why is taxation a good enough form of redistribution? Number one, we think we does eventually account for this privilege. All the arguments Gov has with regards to why privilege accrue have this one conclusion, right? The conclusion is these individuals end up making more money at the end of the day. So if the argument is that's the conclusion that's going to be the case, why not choose a method of taxation that can account for discrimination, disenfranchisement across all those lines, right? So for example, if you're a black man who happens to be really rich, we can account for that, right? With taxation. If you're a poor man who happens to be already poor, it can be counted for a policy of taxation, right? So we think those benefits within taxation is far more sensitive. But secondly, we think it's sensitive to also shifting notions of this enfranchisement. So, for example, if in the far future, the white man is the majority who suffers in America, we think our system is the one who continues to help him. We don't think it's your system at the end of the day. Your system will continue to lock that person into a system that's incredibly harmful. So, what's the comparative here, right? We think on our side, the system is far better able to help disenfranchised communities across racial, across gender, across all these things, all these kind of lives and hold people back. It doesn't matter what race that you are born in, right? It doesn't matter if you happen to be a woman, it doesn't matter who you are in society. At the end of the day, if you're someone who's disenfranchised, we think our system will help you more. We think their system harms you and locks you into and defines you is because you color your skin. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I call upon the next speaker of the European Government, Mr. Revaldi Nathaniel.
Ladies and gentlemen, open opposition has been very dismissive towards Yeni's argument since the get-go. He didn't really argue to you that the current problem right now is not only the fact that people of color would have to fight more in order to be able to gain the benefit that the member of the majority race could otherwise get. And that needs to be compensated by number one, making sure that it is also the concern of the majority race to take a look at this problem and do something about it because it will also affect their well-being. And number two, in the instance we are unable to change those government, means that we and those people means that we need to have more tax revenue that can be allocated to solve those disenfranchisement. That is the material coming from here. It has not been developed at all in that house. Before my discussion, let me first clarify some things. Birth lottery, ladies and gentlemen, should not be a part of this debate at all. Because the way we tax individuals has always been blind to the fact that some of their income, for example, come from birth lottery or come from effort in itself. We think that we have tax both in general, we have tax land that you get maybe through legacy, we have tax income, for example, industries that might come out of those birth lottery as well. But furthermore, understanding that you don't choose to get all of this birth lottery, we can see that means you might not be consented to the harm that you might get out of this policy. At the same time, the benefit that you claim out of the lottery might not be yours as well, right? Because that is not something that you work hard for. That's not something that you are inherited, that you have worked so hard to be entitled of. So just because you don't choose to get those benefits, does not mean that the benefit has been fairly accrued in the first place. That is something open opposition should deal with. Three discussions in my speech. Number one. We believe that income in direct computation towards opening opposition, income tax is not enough to compensate inequality. Why? Because income tax is charged simply because you are more economically capable compared to other people. It does not reflect the hard work that you need to undergo to be able to get that economic capacity. In comparative example, if you take a look at a starting employee, for example, from a people from African American descent and from a Caucasian descent, they might get the same number of income. But for that same amount of income, the people of color must work harder to compete the recruiting committee. I mean so hard, and I'm not a stereotypical, for example, guy that you might be that you expect to be robbers, for example, because that is the reason inequality happens in the first place. Given the fact that that economic level is not compensated, income tax does not compensate the fact that several races might have to fight harder in order to get economic benefit, we think that tax is warranted to the fact that there are inequalities that is currently not included in the calculations of these people. It becomes in the current world, it becomes an externality that is not being held responsible to these people. So income tax is not enough to compensate inequality, ladies and gentlemen. Second discussion, how will this affect people's perception towards racism? Opening opposition conveniently argues will confirm that stereotypes that already exist inside me anyway. So number one, the rebuttal will be the bad stereotypes already exist anyway, so it does not mean necessarily it will be increased, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, that should not be a reason why we should not implement this policy, because that same narrative is also a narrative that is used by rich people in the past to oppose tax in general and to oppose progressive tax in general. The exact same principle that you will confirm that poor people is inherently lazy. So we don't think that that has been and should be the consideration of the government when deciding that a tax should be warranted in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. But we argue to you, even if this confirmed that stereotypes anyway, and because some, bigoted people would exist anyway, the only way to solve this is to ensure that irrespective of why you think racism exists, or irrespective of why you think inequality exists, it is within everyone's interest to solve it, because that is the one that can come into public sphere as opposed to your personal preference of why racial inequality exists. And Gabriel told you the explanation on why this will change people's behavior. We argue to you that in the past, majority don't care about people of minority because it does not affect their life. The way government fight for people of color does not affect me as a part of member of majority race. But now it does. Because insofar as racism still exists, insofar as inequality still exists, my income will also be affected as well. It becomes my responsibility as well in order for me to solve this inequality. And therefore, JB told you that as a result, maybe, for example, if you're an employee, you will have more incentive to give good reviews that is, for example, either favorable towards them or everybody acknowledge the fact that certain people of color might be disadvantaged because of their race, therefore we will give more favorable reviews. It also gives incentive for the holder of power and holder of power in companies to create more policies that is beneficial towards people of color, such as giving scholarship, such as giving recruitment benefits, for example. No, thank you. This will argue that we understand that this might receive backlash, but it has never been our consideration in the first place when the inequality happens. More importantly, we also conclude to say that irrespective of why you think racism exists, the more important thing is how to make sure that everyone has the utmost interest to solve it. But in the case, ladies and gentlemen, where these individuals do not change and still create those racial inequality anyway, that means that the tax will be high and government will have more revenue that they can get out of this policy. What does that mean? So we also point out to you that most likely, ladies and gentlemen, this can be more utilized in order for us to be able to get more distributive policy to make sure that the racial inequality does not exist. No, thank you. But the biggest characteristic that we need to point out in this debate is why all of these incentives do not exist on their world. Number one, individuals, because they don't feel that they're harmed in the current world, they don't have the incentive to do so, and therefore they think that being ignorant in their privilege is way more beneficial. We make that calculation change because now staying in your comfort zone, in your privilege, is no longer beneficial for you. It becomes costly for you if the inequality continues. But number two, currently government under societal pressure always say that maybe I don't have enough money in order to create the distributions, therefore it should be a long process, maybe decades, for example. But now, when you clearly put a tax on racial privilege, you are going to be more expected to create redistribution policy for the sake of racial inequality. You can no longer run away by saying that we don't have the money because we specifically tax you because of racial inequality. People's check and balance will be specific in the terms of how does my tax, tax can be used by the government to create meaningful changes in creating redistributive policy that includes more education, that includes more affirmative action, that includes creating more labor unions and more political parties that are pro towards minority. That's the only way, ladies and gentlemen, we can allow individuals to constantly check and balance with inequality. We need to acknowledge it very well.
Thank you very much for the speech. I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Promoting Opposition, Kasun.
Going to put you. I could go there, you know.
Testing.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, there are three main halves I'm going to argue in my speech. I think the halves that could occur if we actually promote this policy by government, right? So firstly, why this will further promote discrimination in the future. How also secondly, why race relations would not be any better, right, under their policy. And thirdly, the economic downturns and why it's always a bad idea for government to intervene in such matters like taxing, right? Because taxing is all about the economic development of a particular country. So those will be my three main arms that I'll argue in my speech, right? But the principle starts on the opposition side. It's very simple, right? We don't agree with any policy that has anything to do with race, right? We'd rather live in a world where race is not an issue, right? And also, and we also believe that when it comes to taxing, principally, you should only tax when it's based on your income and not based on your race at the end, right? So that was our principle on our side. They failed to engage on Albert's entire speech actually on why we were better in opposing this policy, right? So firstly, and I will incorporate all my rebuttals in my main arguments, right? So firstly, why this promotes discrimination even more, right? So the government, as they are proposing, the government would want to tax you based on the race that you were born in, right? And we think that's bad in two different scenarios, right? So let's say, for example, principally speaking, you are a white person, right? And you earn the same amount of a black person does in terms of a minimum wage. But because of your particular race and because of your past privilege, now you're going to be taxed more compared to that black individual who's earning the same amount of minimum wage amount, right? We think that it also works the other way, where if I'm a black individual who earns billions of dollars now, but just because of my race, I can get a nice tax break, right? And the white person now is also earning billions of dollars, but he can't get the tax break. We think that it promotes that sort of discrimination. It promotes discrimination. It's reverse discrimination because now you're targeting white people who just because they have that particular race and privilege behind them, and you're rewarding individuals who are already making good money, right? And you're giving them a tax break. And we don't think that's a good idea, right? So continuing on. Yeah. So hold on, sit down. Yeah. So that's why it promotes discrimination at the end, right? And we think that in any like government, any country, right? We think that they always set a budget, right? There's always a budget 2017 or budget 28. So let's take, for example, if budget 2017, I know it sounds ridiculous, is $50 trillion, right? In order to make that money happen, now they have to find ways to tax people more. So they will always tax people who are of a particular race, right? To find that 50 trillion. Any economic budget for the year is for the entire country. Race is not taken into consideration. What is taken into consideration is infrastructure, education, welfare, any other things that could make a country run for a year is important, right? So now the governments are forced to find money in order to plug that gap, right? And we think that again, the majority white race, because of their privileges, will be attacked at the end, right? This is exactly what they were trying to argue about, right? That taxing, they were trying to argue that okay, if you tax minorities less, they would have a chance of getting better education. The alternative was that they could get better education at the end, right? But we don't think that's the case, right? What happens now is that you're telling corporations around the world is that when we're taxing people based on their race, then we're going to pay them less now because they're getting tax breaks, right? So we don't think that the trade-off of, well, if I'm being taxed less, I can get better education for my children. But no, corporations will come in now and say, well, I'm going to pay you less now, so you still remain the same person that you were even after that policy comes through, right? So that's a problem on their side, right? Secondly, now, why race relations could get any worse? And I love bringing up the fact that Trump got elected based on this exact problem, right? So in 2015, in the United States of America, white people at the end will become a minority, right? And that's the recent white lash that happened in 2016 because they knew Trump would protect their vested interests at the end, right? So now, if we try to implement this policy and we get to 2050, right, what's going to happen naturally is the minority races now will become majority races, and now will do their own sort of taxing and reverse discrimination on white people now, right? That means that in the future, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, if the minority races are now the majority, they'll put it back, they'll reverse the discrimination back on white people. So we think in the long term, right, there's this negative domino effect that would occur if you try to implement this policy, right? So further, sit down. What's worse is now you're normalizing this idea that everybody has got a race, right? And we think that's a negative idea because you're normalizing that one race is that race just because of what happened in the past. Right? I think we should try to move on in the 21st century and try to ignore the racial past that have happened, right? And we think that even in cases where we have done wrong against minorities, we think that governments already in status quo have forgiven and apologized and paid for all those things. And we think that we should move on past the race part, right? So you're turning different races against each other, right? So their argument was this: if you force a tax on white people just because of the privilege they have against black people, then white people will become more apologetic and will be more understanding of the causes of minority races. Right? We think that that's not necessarily going to happen at all, right? Because why should we be protecting them more? As an individual who's a white person, why should I care now about the minority? Because he's got a tax break. We're already helping them out so much. Why should I do anything anymore? And politicians as well in the future would not have to cater to minority races anymore. There's no political will will for them to actually come out in public and say, yeah, I understand your problem, but guess what? We're already giving you a tax break, right? So we don't think there's any incentives for politicians and any incentives for the majority races to help these people further, right? So we think that disenfranchises the community even worse. Closing.
Do you think it's possible that your privilege comes as a result of the oppression of other people?
Okay. So I already discussed that. In the past, it may have happened, right? And we think in status quo, governments have already taken the initiative to apologize and pay them back and give them everything that they needed in order to forgive past debts, right? But right now, in a world where we don't want to consider race as a factor, right? We think that when you're taxing a country, you should not consider race as a priority. You should tax them based on their income because the amount of money you will receive is to help everybody around the world, right? So finally, the economic downturns and why governments are the wrong people to do this sort of taxing, right? So I already talked about the idea of how corporations now will have an incentive to pay less, or even an incentive to not even hire, to even fire majority white people, because they know now that at the end of the day that they would have to pay them more just because of their tax break, right? So we think that governments and politicians will be forced to put policies out there in order to force corporations to pay white people more just because of the fact they're getting taxed more, right? And we think that that's very harmful at the end. Governments at the end are notoriously inefficient, right? Corporations the main aim is always to maximize profit, right? And the government's responsibility is always maximize accountability. We think that they're mixing the government and business together. I think that's really harmful at the end. And we think there's always going to be a negative backlash if you try to bring race into the equation. With that, very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for the speech. To start the closing half of the debate, I call upon the first speaker, Member of Government from Closing Government, Benjamin Rose.
Okay, don't worry. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. All right, thanks. Hello, amongst the many things that serving in the army has shown me, it has shown me to recognize my privilege as a Chinese Singaporean. Here's the reason why. Because being colorblind makes you ignorant of the various intersectionalities and struggles that people have. So when the previous speaker tells us that we want to limit race in our collective imagination of society, it is just sad. Because I think that for a Black American who has been denied opportunities by the government in the past, I think that he or she deserves the ability to lead a good life that they want to live. Their policy prevents them from doing so in this debate. Because I want to recognize one thing. In the debate about this house prefers, we we need to consider what the world looks like in comparison. I think when we're talking about social policy, we're talking about government signals and what signals a government understand with people. If anything, I think that what the world needs now is discussion of race and how race affects the way that we live our lives. I'm going to bring you 2 points in extension coming up from closing government. Race affects your social construction of reality in a way that is both permanent and lasting. 2, why your racial privilege holds you to a certain obligation vis-a-vis other people. So first, how race affects your social construction of reality or rebuttals are going to be integrated. So, how is this extension different from opening government? Because OG talks about how there's access, education, and job is hindered. We will tell you that the way race affects you is it affects the way that you yourself and your opportunities in life. Why is that? So, what does being in a specific ways do to your interaction with other people in your society? Because I'm Singaporean Chinese, I'm going to talk about Chinese privilege and what it did for me as a Chinese individual. As a Chinese individual, I was told since now I have access many things. I go to university, I go do lots of things. But as in the army, when I talk to them really, because my Malay community, for instance, they don't see themselves in the matter. They see themselves as people who are not going to go to university. They see themselves as going to polytechnics and graduating and immediately joining the workforce. The reason why this is so is because they don't have it, and they don't have any role models around them to like inspire them. Like literally, there's only one Malay president scholar in Singapore in 2010. Even he was very privileged in that regard. There are no people around them to say, hey, look, maybe you'll be able to access that good life as well. This means that the polarization is happening. It affects the way that you construct your reality in this debate. Why is that? Because this means 2 things for those individuals. Number 1, they cannot visualize or imagine themselves in things like high schools or working for government sector. Because no one around them accesses a sort of opportunities in the first place. I don't claim that people outside the house will achieve those things, but I will claim that at the very least the government sings and say, look, race is an important consideration as to why people don't access opportunities. At the very least, people can start to consider, maybe I can do those things if it wasn't for my race. At the very least, I will surmount a lot of obstacles that the race brings them in the first place. But the conclusion to this part is to say that these people right now don't even try. Because they don't need to make it in the first place. Therefore, when it comes to things like jobs in the future, they are never going to get it because they don't see themselves as good enough. No. But the second thing is important here, right? Because opening up asks us, what is the privilege that is manifested that is not manifested by economic status? I think it's this. I think that these people don't feel themselves as worthy even when they do deserve to achieve those things. Because they think that they're the exception, not the norm. They think that they got there because they were lucky, not because they worked their asses off in the first place. This looks like them rejecting these great opportunities that they deserve, but they don't think that they deserve the opportunity, first of all. I think that's fair. So when opening up claims that this body crystallizes and institutionalizes races, I think this is good. I think it's good for us to focus our discussion and focus our political capital on how race affects the way that we live our lives at this point in time. If anything, our policy is a much better world in this debate. And on this first motion, you need to prove to us why your world is comparatively better. But how does this relate to the mechanism of the text in this debate? Because here's the thing, right? All claims that the government is the wrong actor to do so, but at the same time, they claim that corporations want to profit execute. We can ask this question. Then where is the incentive ignorable for any of the civil changes in the first place? If it's not the government doing this, you still trust that government sector to say, hey, I'm going to employ that kind of tax to do the world, and it's fine. I think it's unreasonable in this debate, no tax, right? So when you say that our system of people in specific positions, I think that's a very convenient argument. We can support a role where in the event in which a white person is more privileged in the future, they say black American, they will just shoot the tax in another way around. But it's important for us to recognize that race affects the way that our lives are being constructed by us at this point. This affects that our agency is starting to have a growth, it affects the way that we view ourselves, but more importantly, affects our future. I think it's important for us to consider this in this debate. More importantly, I think that governments owe a duty to everyone to make sure that they are able to be a good life. I'll this more my second argument. So, why is it that your racial privilege poses you in certain obligations? Before I tell you why, yes.
Disenfranchised community, whether women or black people or disabled people, already benefit the most from social welfare that is funded by our income taxation. So we already help individuals that are discriminated. We don't need your policy.
I think it's unfair to say that black Americans are discriminated right now. Okay, so why is it that your privilege goes to certain obligations? 2 reasons. 1, your privilege comes as a result of the oppression of other people. Look to African Americans in America who are enslaved by white Americans. They say our policy is a specific form of discrimination is perpetuated by the government. But you must understand, panel, the governments were involved in discrimination in the past as well, right? Look at Australia, where they literally stole Aboriginal children in the stolen generation. Look at Black Americans who were denied education in public schools because governments say they could. I think it's damn right that these people had their struggles validated by the government in this way. But more importantly, right, second reason, even if the sort of privilege is morally right, it still goes that your privilege places you in a special advantage and a special position vis-a-vis with other people around you. I don't think it can be morally to have people around you because you won't be very ugly if it works for them because they will be here without my coach in this case. They say, oh, but blah 3, you have any agency. One, this is an argument against any form of taxation because you have no control over what sort of like economic status that you want into. Doesn't argument extends to absolute. But two, this is irrelevant because even without choice, you still benefit from the privilege nonetheless. So I think if you benefit from it, then you deserve to pay a tax accordingly. Why do we talk about equality as an end goal? Because equality looks like the ability of people to live their definition of the good life. Oftentimes, people don't get to do so because they are hindered by structural barriers that either built or imagined in a sociological sense. Why is this good? Because we and the government, in principle, need to empower everyone to be able to pursue their definition of the good life. Because we invest power in the government to protect us and our lives. If any governments ought to protect our conception of the good life in this regard, I think that being part of a Chinese privilege gives me the ability to accept opportunities that other people don't have. I think our policy is start recognizing that privilege. Very happy to support this mission.
Thank you very much for the speech. I call upon the first speaker from the closing opposition team, Mr. Ian Dilachan.
Before I begin my substantive extensions, I'm going to begin with a couple of rebuttals. 3 points of rebuttals. Firstly, the incentive structure arguments, which was the most valuable part of like open opposition's case. We think that's not true. We think that there's a natural counter incentive for like the white privileged people to actually go against it. Why? Because the point at which you like give equal rights to the people that you have helped to disenfranchise, you necessarily have a cost to yourself. Meaning, the point at which you have more jobs for black kids, this means that the kids whom you own, the white kids, your children are less likely to get that jobs in the first place. This means the point at which you want to increase the amount of like welfare given to black people, you necessarily have to increase the amount of taxation you get. So we don't think that that incentive system happens in your world. Second rebuttal. Firstly, second rebuttal, the racial privilege obligation. They say that since individuals in general live in a society whereby other black people are disenfranchised, they have a natural moral obligation to go and help these people. We don't think this is true. The fact is that individual suffering is individualistic. What does this mean? This means that you have no greater moral obligation to help someone that you were not directly culpable in the first place. We don't think that this super blanket punishment towards all white people just because some black people are disenfranchised is an effective form of punishment in your world. We don't think that is okay. So, third argument, that argument of revenge and recuperation, how this is like a form of like a revenge for all the horrible things that white people have done to Native Americans, right? Well, I've already answered that in my earlier rebuttal. The exact same answer still applies. They will never compensate, therefore they have no moral obligation to like answer for it. But secondly, we think that all of these things have already been counted in opening opposition when they said that they've already received the payment to recuperate for these things already. Go.
Sir, don't you mean that the natural incentive of Caucasian people is to keep the privilege in order to save their kids, and that's inherently unfair? And in your world, are you opposing this policy on tax in general?
Well, I'm actually going to reply to that later in my substantive. I sometimes this will be covered in two key areas. Firstly, why you necessarily just like dump all possibility of actual social change And secondly, why this sort of like recuperation is necessarily disproportionate and therefore principally wrong. So, firstly, why you necessarily destroy all possible forms of social change? We think at a point, we think that in the status quo, right? All movements to bring the racial minority up rely on the charity of the people holding power structure. Meaning that things like the Black Lives Movement rely on things like emphasis from the white majority. What this means is that the first thing you have to do to like convince these people to actually support you is to convince them that there is a problem in the first place. Meaning you have to emphasize on the fact that these people are disenfranchised. You have to emphasize on the fact that these people are human too. At the point in which you impose an unfair form of taxation on the white people for having white skin, which reflects more like light, we think that immediately causes like a form of like divide in between these two races. Why? Because now these people are not likely to emphasize with them. Because at the point in which I am a millionaire and all the hard-earned money I earn, I have to give 100,000 up a year because I'm white. That means that all of that, like in fact, all of that, I look at my neighbor who's just a black guy who gets to keep all his money. We think that immediately crushes all hopes of like all hopes that we can convince individuals to actually act in the first place. Go ahead.
If you reach the benefit of oppression, are you complicit in terrorism oppression that happens to people?
Absolutely not. We think that these individuals are just living their lives. They just want to go to school. Just because doing so, it means that this complex social structure of a black person who's oppressed like 20 miles away from you does not get the same job. We don't think that you're complicit in that just because you reap the advantages that you propose under your side. So, moving on to my second issue. Why this sort of like why this sort of thing is disproportionate and therefore morally unjust? We think that's not just like economic disadvantages that you get at the point in which you are born a black person. It is things like a lack of security when you are like being your people are being shot down by the police force. These things like microaggressions that you face on a daily basis, where white people feel like you're more of like a criminal. Why is all of this not compensated for by this form of taxation? Because none of these things are quantifiable by money. Meaning that I cannot pay you and say that makes up for the fact that you are unable to feel a sense of security. I cannot pay you money and say, look, that makes up for the fact that I am like, my people have like oppressed you for so long. We don't think that's okay. And why is this necessary counters all of the other forms of like repayment that we have under our side? Because of the analysis that all of opposition bent has been pushing to you. The fact that these tax cuts necessarily antagonizes and polarizes the majority and the minority in both of our worlds. Because of the fact that these tax cuts necessarily prevent the ability for social movements to convince people, hey, there really is a problem at the point at which black people are being oppressed. We think that what will happen in your world is that we are going to have like a large amount of politicians who go up and say, no, this is not true. At the point in which a black person tries to rise up and say, we are facing all of this discrimination, what will happen in your world is that, first of all, people won't buy that, right? Because of the fact that these people already get super special tax cuts, which prevent them from actually being taxed as much as the person who just happens to have white skin. I suppose, go ahead.
Yeah, currently we tax poor people and there are still politicians vouching for poor people. It does not mean that the people will suddenly be wrong.
Well, we think that poor people get taxed with what? No, we think that the reason why we are allowed to help poor people is because of the unfortunate socio-economic status in the first place. But the problem here is that there is a fact that there are poor white people who are also going to be taxed in your world. There are rich black people who deserve to be taxed, who just happen to be born in a really accepting neighborhood, who happen to make it out, who deserve to be taxed, but simply do not, because of the fact that he was just born to like a woman with black skin. We don't think that that's the point whereby it's just in your world. So, why is it necessarily unquantifiable and impossible to recuperate? Because number one, all of these things are individualistic, meaning that it just happens to, these are arbitrary factors. You could be born in like a really accepting neighborhood and therefore not have to like account for all of the horrible discrimination you face. You could be born in a neighborhood with a police force that actually cares for your security. You could be born in like neighborhoods which are already focused in terms of like black movements to try and help the black people. we don't think it's okay for your world to take all of these individuals and give them the exact same privileges which are meant to help the people who have faced discrimination in the first place. Never be prouder to oppose.
Thank you very much for the speech. I call upon the final speaker from the government bench, the government with Mr. Joel.
I think it is extremely convenient for side opposition to characterize the sufferings of individuals of the minority groups in the status quo as having been a thing of the past. We tell you that things that we see in the status quo through things like police brutality towards black people already show things, for example, like that guys, like racial differences are salient enough for us to still have microaggressions, not only for people, but also for us to brutally assault them because we have this notion that they might be somewhat different from us or have a certain tendency to be or act in ways that are necessarily threatening to us. I think that's fundamentally the first problem of side opposition. But the second problem with side opposition is that a lot of the benefits were contingent on that assumption, right? We tell you that the status quo currently is oppressive, right? When Benjamin came up here to tell you that, guys, look, like, the problem with the status quo is that the way you perceive yourself affects the way you can access opportunities and the way you can therefore lead a meaningful life, right? This is the problem. When you're not able to change those perceptions, you constantly live in that oppressed reality anyway. That means to say, hello, that these people don't live in don't live in some sort of liberation or liberated reality at the other side of the house. In their side of the house, they get, on the best case scenario, an oppressed reality that these people perceive. That means to say that when people find their situation is real, they are real in their consequences. That is to say that people who find themselves as too oppressed and they will perceive themselves in a certain way and they will try and they will therefore deepen the kind of fractures in the status quo within the dominant racial group and the minority racial group in the first place. That is the problem of the side opposition. I'm going to talk about a lot of things in my speech. No, thank you. Right? But is this really fair? Okay, this is the weirdest thing coming up of open opposition, right? Open opposition suggests that this prioritization is unfair because other groups are disenfranchised. On top of the fact that this is not really a zero-sum game, more importantly, if you concede that under your side of the house, you can uplift people because of the race privilege correlation that we have, then that means to say you have made your argument really blunt, right? The question is then, if the outcomes are the same as us, why then should we avoid the model that side government is going for? And to that end, I don't think any of you debaters from this side of the house really prove that, right? So if you can tell us that your best case scenario is lifting people out of inequality anyway, and then on the side of the house you say, at best case scenario we can lift people out of inequality, then what's the point of that? How does it prove that how does it prove the exclusive moral principle benefit under the side of the house, right? No, thank you. So let's talk about it then, right? Now it also says that people have no choice but to choose, people have no choice to choose their privilege. Yeah. Here's the thing, it's precisely the same scenario for those who are existing who exist in a disenfranchised world, right? More importantly, people with racial privilege more likely are able to make good decisions that are supported by existing structures in society, right? The difference between them and the disenfranchised is that at best, they have last ceilings for these people who are currently disenfranchised. And the worst case scenario, existing structures and biases in society make it easier for you to fail in contrast to someone that comes from the dominant majority. So sure, you get no choice to choose to be born privileged. We recognize that. But recognize this as well, panel. You get greater accessibility to choices. You ensure that you get some form of ideal self. Right? No, thank you. This is why the status quo is fundamentally oppressive. Because you perceive that your choices are still limited. The point at which you can tell us that your side of the house
is going to lift people up in quality but not able to change the perceptions of themselves, we tell you that the mechanism is still very blunt. Right? Giving them a chance to even conceptualize the future for themselves is the unique moral benefit coming up from CG's case. This is why Ben said extension was very important today. Like, giving them a chance to even conceptualize the future for themselves requires us to show that the state recognizes the disenfranchisement and is willing to make changes and do something about it. Right? Opposition's role is likely to make people more disempowered and disillusioned. But
do you not concede that in the status quo there are already so many mechanisms that are deliberately pointed towards poor black people?
I think that's not a very sensitive response to the perception and the social construction of reality extension coming out of the But more importantly, that I think it's very crucial to point out, right, that Ben told you that this is problematic, right? Because of the idea of learned helplessness. That is to say, after so many failed attempts across generations of people, you are likely to then internalize the litigation of your identity. That is to say, to believe that you are just limited in the things you could possibly be. Right? This is a form of oppression in the status quo that opening opposition conveniently forgets. Right? The agency that they talked about, the agency for you to construct or conceptualize your ideal self is limited. That is the extent of the inequality. This is the true extent of inequality was ignored in the opening house. Right? Secondly, how then do we get how then do we get reforms for structures and better change in the long run? Let's look at what OO told us, right? OO told us and asserted was that race relations will take a turn for the worse due to some sort of positive discrimination because we crystallize racial differences. I think it's important to think about the reactions that are likely in this data, right? The anger of perceived government inaction versus the sort and then thereby the displaced aggression towards the majority, or perhaps the majority's supposed backlash, right? Let's be real, right? If you are part of the privileged class, then I think when you won't feel the pinch, you don't feel the pinch as much as someone from the minority group when you're being taxed, right? But more importantly, racial differences are already crystallized. That is the problem with the status quo, right? It's very disingenuous for them to suggest otherwise. CJ concedes that you needed to basically correct the current social structures. But how do you do it when either A, these people perceive themselves as likely to fail, and B, which is the either likely scenario, the other likely scenario, you either when these don't feel like you should interact with these people at all because they are not going to give you a chance to anything. Right, so either you think you will fail, or you just feel that the majority of the people of the majority are basically hostile towards you. The point at which you do that, right, and create that sort of environment, a hostile environment, is the point at which you actively limit people's choices. That is why it's inherently oppressive, and this is the kind of unique extension coming from CG. Right? Either that this oppression necessarily means that on the best case scenario, the rest of the house only keeps the reality or proves up the facade rather of some of things getting better. So the best case scenario or the worst case scenario, best case scenario is you get the same outcomes but you don't change people's perceptions. On a best case scenario, we empower the privileged. Worst case scenario on CG is that you don't fully level the playing field. But I tell you that ultimately, if you're talking about justice today, you should really consider the fact that for far too long we've neglected people and we've taken them out of the system and disenfranchised them by through things like slavery and accumulating and capital through injustice. For far too long we've ignored these people from all these people very, very far.
Thank you very much for the speech. To conclude the grand finals, I call upon the final speaker for the opposition fair to the opposition with Sandor.
So, first of all, we're getting something from open house and then moving on to rebuttals from closing government. And then moving into the wrap up of why we're different from open house and a convenient thing that happened on the side of closing government. So, first of all, the first area of the opening rebuttals, right? Some things I addressed is how he said that the birth lottery itself is not a factor that we should look into in this debate. We say that fixing the birth lottery, as said in their case, is the essential point which they made in their case, and therefore birth lottery is already essential in their case. Because what they're essentially doing, what they said that they will do is they can redistribute the money from this tax revenue, right? They're gonna essentially make the government play Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving the poor, and saying this is justified because the majority of the rich are white people and the majority of the poor are black people. We say that this is wrong. Why do we say that? We say that people they should help other poor people. They're not essentially the black people, not even because they're the majority, right? We just say that because of the more accurate gauge which we give, which is that of the gauge of income, right? The natural tax income. The natural mechanic of tax income, which we give in status quo, right, is a lot more accurate than judging people by their skin color. Right? We don't want to necessarily disadvantage someone, such as the poor white man, which is in the corner, which suffers in this case which they're presenting, which they never addressed. The rich black men, which are not affected at all by this supposed proportionate tax, income tax. So now, we like to say how they never address the issue of how the color of skin is not a better gauge of privilege in comparison to direct income. Right? We say that the direct income that is incorporated in this debate is a much better gauge than saying, oh, because you're white, you're going to be put at disadvantage compared to the black people because a certain majority of white people are richer than the black people. Right? We say this is not accurate in the debate, and they never provided any mechanism accuracy factor. So now, onto my closing commentary. So he came up here and talked about race in the construction of social reality. Right? He said that essentially what they said was that these people have a lower self-expectation because they are trapped into this the position of being the minority, right? Because they accept that they are the minority and that no government can come of this from this person because he doesn't think that he deserves it. He thinks that he's the minority naturally, and he conforms to what society tells him that he is the minority. We say that first of all, that viewpoint please sit down. We say first of all that viewpoint is extremely individualistic. In case that you're not looking at society as a whole. And often the reason why you think like this is because you live in a ghetto area, a place which conveniently subverts the point of certain black people or certain minorities being born into these more privileged areas than others, right? We think that so the concept of ghettoization does not belong in this debate, and therefore should not be addressed. Accepted.
The problem that you just addressed did not take a look at how the system can fix itself if people are not continuously incentivized to solve it and can continuously maintain their privilege just for the sake of their children.
I'll handle that in my next rebuttal, actually, of how the alternatives that are already present in the status quo will be able to fix will be able to fulfill the conditions that closing government gave up, and will be able to fix the problems of discrimination which happen in our society. Please sit down. Right. So first of all, the next rebuttal from closing government will be how they conveniently ignore that things like Black Lives Matter or social movements and poor people movements themselves are not a concurrent factor in this debate. Right? They ignore the fact that there are already other mechanisms in place, other dynamics that are moving to the other movements that are trying to help these people, right? And we think that separating them from the mechanic of taxation is something we have to fulfill because of the harms that come directly from it, which we have proved on our side, right? So, first of all, let's talk more about the alternatives which are present, right? First of all, they're already here in status quo, they're at the ready to fight for what they believe in. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement has already proven how they can initiate change in society, and poor people's welfare is always present in the form of what is presented by the government. But before that, accept it.
Which suffering is worse? The pain you feel as a white man to our tax model, or the deprivation of agency for many generations of people?
First of all, we feel that supposed suffering, which you say is from the many generations of people, cannot be quantified by just putting that mechanic into the tax system by saying that we're going to naturally disadvantage you. We don't think that you can quantify the pain and suffering of someone that's been oppressed and persecuted for generations by just saying, we're going to shove money in your face, so you shut up. because we think that's how we should equally give you back your rights, right? We don't think that once you've been shut off from your rights for these so-called millions of generations, which they have characterized on their case, right? We don't think that money is an equivalent medium so which you can repair, which you can perform reparation for these people. Please sit down. So next, on to the argument about the life matter. Closing, government we put up all these special conditions which we said we had to fulfill. We say that these automatically fulfill themselves in the form of the movements which we have said, right? And we say that if we're able to solve the problem of discrimination on our side, we say that we should not, in turn, our side is better because we should not require that solving that discrimination in turn means discriminating the white people who have supposedly been on the top by shifting the power balance such that now they are at the bottom and the black people are at the top, right? So now, first a wrap up of why would a wrap up of our case and why would it be right? First of all, we talked about my speaker talked about dumping of the possibility of social change and how the dependency factor, which is based on the generosity of these white people, ladies and gentlemen, will be lost when the government openly admits to saying that there is already affirmative action being done to help these people in our tax system, and you do not need to worry about this, right? We said that the generosity factor is lost on their side, and by ones such as the Black Lives Matter and the involvement of white people in fighting for the rights of black people will be gone entirely on their side, right? And therefore no social change will come about because the majority will never consent it to be wrong, right? So now, my speaker also talked about the quality of reparation and why money cannot quantify the forms of suffering that these people feel, right? I already addressed this in the POS they brought up, but I'd like to expand on it more, right? First of all, it solves the social, money cannot fully solve the social discrimination in society. And we say that there is a necessity to operate separate from the taxation mechanic because we feel that it is not required to be the taxation mechanic in the first place. And I'd also like to point out how social government never cut our arguments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Speakers and possible statements, the judges will leave the front for the debate.
Thank you.